Okay, gentlemen, here we have the Avro Vulcan from Iris Simulations. Now, Tom, I know that you've got it and you're having issues with the startup procedure, so I'm doing this video just to help you guys out. Harry, I know you're getting it, so this video will be a lot of help to you in order to help with the startup procedure, because it can be quite tricky. Now what the Vulcan does, which separates it from the rest of any other aircraft, is that you cannot start the engines independently. You have to start engine 1 first and then cross bleed all the air produced from that engine into the other 3 engines one at a time to start them up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to start up the Vulcan using the normal procedure, because the Vulcan actually has 2 start-up procedures, one normal and the other rapid start, which was used during the Cold War for scrambles. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you the normal start-up procedure. So the first thing we need to do, we need to get these armrests out of the way to give us more room. Okay, so on our right hand side we have the the starboard control panel, I think it's called. So if you look on the bottom, you have 2 switches. The one on the right is the rotating beacon, and the one on the left is the electronics master switch. So we're going to go ahead and switch that on, so we should now have power to the aircraft. And if you were just to look to your left in the cockpit, you'll see that the landing leg indicator lights are now green, which show that we're getting power to the aircraft. Okay, so up the top here we have 4 little buttons, and they are the bleed air toggles, which allow us to feed air from one engine to the other. Okay, so I've switched number 1 engine on because that's the one that we're going to be starting first. Okay, so in the center here we have our fuel control panel. So all these little switches here in the center are all your cross bleed for your fuel, which allow you to swap fuel from tank to tank. But because I want it nice and evenly taken, I'm going to switch all them on. At the top here we have the 4 fuel pumps. So your top 2 are your outer engines, and the bottom 2 are your engines, your inner engines. So we're going to go ahead and click on number 1, which should allow us to start engine number 1. Okay, so if we look to our left at the bottom here, we have our ignition panel with all the switches and knobs and buttons and everything on, which we're going to use to start the aircraft. And we also have, if you'll notice, a row of red lights here. Now this is what they call your PFC, your powered flight control. If I just look at the controls column for a second, I'm actually currently moving my joystick, but there's no movement in that whatsoever, because the PFC is currently off. But once we switch all them on, switch all the lights off, you then, once you've done that, you should get a green light saying artificial fuel, which then states that your column control stick is activated and ready to go. Okay, so back to the ignition panel. So in the bottom left hand corner we have the ignition switch, so we're going to switch that on. Okay, and we've got a master switch which we're going to use, we're going to put to start. As you'll see that the cross feed indicator is on to say that it's cross feeding, and then the switch above that is the engine start type. So you've obviously got rapid or normal, and we're going to stay with normal for the time being. So we're going to go ahead and fire up engine 1. So as you can hear, the starters are turning over engine 1. So we're going to wait for that to spool, and then once it's spooled up it should ignite. Fingers crossed. Okay, so that's engine 1 started. Now, in order for me to start the other 3 engines, we have to use the power from engine 1. So again, we need to go up to the bleed air toggles, and we need to switch. I'm going to go with engine 4 next, so we're going to switch on engine 4. Now if you notice, when I click engine 4, no blue light to say that it started, and that's because I haven't got enough power. So what you need to do, you need to increase the throttle of engine 1 to around 26% on the control, or 50% on your RPM indicator, depending on which you fancy. You can go more than 50%, but 50% should suffice. It's normally around the 26% mark. So now we're up to the 50% mark. Engine 4 has started the ignition process, and it should fire any second. Once you've got your igniters spinning and spooling, you then need to switch on your fuel pump, and that should ignite engine 4. There we go. So while we're starting the other 3 engines, the throttle needs to stay at 50% until you finish the startup process. We're going to go ahead with engine 3, so again back to our air bleed toggle for engine 2, sorry. Switch on our fuel pump for engine 2, back to the ignition panel, fire up engine number 2, blue light to say that the ignition process has started. So as you can see by the dial, your little dial in there to say that the engine spooling is now going, and that should ignite. So engine number 2 is now fired and starting, should be idling. Engine number 3. Again, use your bleed air switch, your fuel pump switch, and then your ignition switch. That should then start the ignition process for engine number 3. So that's engine number 3 started. So once all 4 engines are running, you can reduce the throttle on engine 1 back down to idle. You can then close your air bleed screws because they're no longer needed, and then we can nip back to the ignition panel. We can turn the ignition off, the starter off, and that concludes the startup procedure on the Vulcan. You would now be ready for taxi. The only thing left to do, obviously, if you notice, there's still some warning lights on the main console. On our right hand side instrument panel, we have a button that says pressure head heater, and you normally switch that on and the flap would go over to say that it's on, and then your warning lights are out. So at this current point you would be ready for your taxi to runway, and that concludes this video.